There is a moment in some friendships that feels almost invisible. Nothing dramatic happens, no argument, no betrayal, no clear rupture, just a small tightening behind the smile. You notice it when they share good news and your applause feels half a second delayed. You notice it when their excitement feels strangely loud, when their stories feel longer than usual, when their success feels heavier than it should. And then comes the confusion. Why does this bother you? They have done nothing wrong. They are not cruel, not arrogant, not unkind. In fact, they may be exactly who they have always been. So what changed? Resentment rarely announces itself as resentment. It disguises itself as exhaustion, as mild annoyance, as a sudden need for space. You tell yourself you're just busy, just stressed, just in a different season of life. But something inside feels unsettled. You begin to notice how often they talk about their progress, how easily opportunities seem to find them, how their confidence fills a room. And without meaning to, you begin measuring their milestones against yours, their recognition against your silence, their glow against your quiet struggle. Comparison slips in softly, almost politely. At first it feels harmless, human, but slowly the emotional temperature changes. Conversations that once felt warm now feel competitive. Compliments feel complicated. Even admiration carries a trace of bitterness. And the most painful part is not the resentment itself. It is the guilt that follows because you love them, or at least you believe you do. So how can love coexist with irritation? How can loyalty sit beside envy? How can someone you once celebrated begin to trigger something fragile inside you? This is where many people look away. They suppress the feeling, push it down, smile harder, speak sweeter, pretend nothing has shifted. But resentment does not disappear when ignored. It settles, like fine dust in a quiet room, invisible at first, then slowly thickening the air. You may begin canceling plans more often, replying slower, offering shorter responses. Not because you consciously want distance, but because your nervous system is trying to protect something tender. Sometimes resentment is not about the other person at all. Sometimes it is the sound of your own unmet longing echoing in their presence. But in the beginning, all you feel is the tightening, the smile that no longer feels effortless, the warmth that feels slightly forced, the subtle wish that they would dim themselves just a little so you do not feel so exposed, and you do not talk about it. Because who admits to resenting a friend? Who confesses that another person's happiness feels like a mirror reflecting your own quiet dissatisfaction? So you carry it silently, a polite expression on the outside, a complicated emotion underneath, and the friendship continues. But something has shifted. Friendship often begins in sameness, similar dreams, similar struggles, similar starting lines. You met when neither of you had much to prove, when life felt wide and undefined, when both of you were still becoming. In those early days, there is comfort in equality. No one is ahead. No one is behind. You are simply walking side by side. But life rarely unfolds in parallel. One of you moves faster. One finds clarity sooner. One receives recognition earlier. And slowly the shared rhythm changes. They begin to rise. You begin to question. Not because you want them to fall, but because their ascent quietly highlights your own uncertainty. Comparison is not loud. It does not shout accusations. It whispers measurements. Where am I in relation to them? Why do they seem more certain? What did they do differently? At first, the comparison feels motivating. Their success inspires you. Their discipline pushes you. Their growth feels like proof that something is possible. But over time, inspiration can turn into evaluation. You start noticing the differences more than the similarities. The gap feels wider, their achievements feel like milestones you have not reached, their confidence feels like something you misplaced. And beneath all of it is a fragile question. Am I enough? Human beings are wired for social comparison. The mind constantly scans for position and belonging. It looks for cues about worth and status. not out of cruelty, but out of survival. In ancient times, position meant safety. Being valued meant protection. Being admired meant influence. The nervous system still carries this ancient code. So when a friend excels, something primal can stir. A quiet alarm, a subtle threat response. If they are shining, what does that say about me? It is not logical, it is not generous, but it is deeply human, especially when identity feels unstable. If your sense of worth is still forming, another person's progress can feel like erosion, like a tide pulling at the edges of who you believe you are. And so resentment begins to take shape. Not because you despise them, not because you wish them harm, but because their success presses against your insecurity. It reminds you of dreams you delayed, risks you avoided, efforts you abandoned. They become a living reflection of the path you might have taken. And reflection is not always comfortable. Instead of connection, there is quiet calculation. Instead of presence, there is internal comparison. Instead of celebration, there is silent self-evaluation. The friendship shifts from shared experience to internal scoreboard. You may still laugh together, still talk, still show up, but inside something is keeping count, not of their failures, but of your perceived lack. And that is where resentment quietly roots itself. Not in hatred, but in wounded self-worth. Friendship feels emotional, personal, moral. But beneath every emotion, there is a nervous system interpreting the world. And the brain does not understand friendship the way poetry does. It understands hierarchy, safety, belonging. When someone close to you succeeds, the brain automatically evaluates position. Not consciously, not maliciously, simply instinctively. Am I rising or falling within my social environment? Research in psychology shows that humans measure themselves most intensely against those who are similar. Not strangers, not celebrities, but peers. People who share a starting point, a background, a dream. A friend who once stood beside you becomes the most relevant mirror. When their life expands, the brain registers a shift, even if the heart still cares. Deep within the social circuits of the mind, status is tied to survival. For most of human history, belonging to a group meant protection, value meant access, recognition meant influence. To fall behind could mean exclusion. So when a friend achieves something meaningful, the brain can interpret it as a subtle threat. Not because their gain is your loss in reality, but because the nervous system reads success as movement within a shared ladder. If they are climbing, where does that leave you? This reaction happens in milliseconds. Before maturity, before compassion, before conscious thought. The emotional brain reacts first, a small contraction, a flicker of discomfort, a quiet alert, and then the thinking mind rushes in to make sense of it. You might tell yourself you're just tired, just annoyed, just sensitive. But underneath that narrative, the comparison system is active. The same neural pathways that process physical pain can activate during social comparison. The same circuitry that responds to threat can light up during perceived status loss. That heaviness in your chest is not imagination. It is biology intertwined with identity. Yet here's the paradox. The brain can hold admiration and envy at the same time. It can love someone and still feel threatened by them. It can celebrate outwardly while tightening inwardly, because humans are layered. Emotional complexity does not mean moral failure. It means the nervous system is navigating identity in a social world. And if your identity feels uncertain, their certainty can feel destabilizing. If your goals feel delayed, their momentum can feel exposing. So the resentment that forms is often less about the friend and more about the meaning your brain attaches to their growth. It is not their success alone. It is what that success whispers to your self-image. It asks questions you may not want to answer. Who am I becoming? Why do I feel behind? What have I been avoiding? The brain seeks coherence. When someone close moves forward while you feel still, it creates tension, and tension seeks resolution. Sometimes that resolution becomes motivation. Sometimes it becomes quiet inspiration. But sometimes when insecurity is strong, it becomes resentment. Not because you're cruel, but because your nervous system is trying to protect a fragile sense of worth. And protection can sometimes look like bitterness. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from feeling something you believe you should not feel. Resentment toward a friend carries this quiet moral weight. You tell yourself you should be happy for them, you should be supportive, you should be grateful to have someone thriving in your life, and yet something inside resists. This is where the inner war begins. On one side, there is loyalty, history, shared memories, the version of you that genuinely cares about their well-being. On the other side, there is a tightening, a heaviness, a small voice asking why their light makes you feel dimmer. The mind tries to correct the feeling. It scolds it, suppresses it, minimizes it. Stop being jealous. Stop being insecure. They deserve this. But emotions do not disappear simply because they are judged. They retreat, they go underground, and what is pushed down does not dissolve. It transforms. Sometimes into sarcasm, sometimes into subtle criticism, sometimes into emotional distance that neither of you can quite explain. You may find yourself less available, less enthusiastic, slightly colder, not dramatically, just enough to create a thin, invisible wall. And then comes the shame, because you notice the shift. You notice your own withdrawal, and you do not like what it says about you. You begin protecting your self-image. You highlight their flaws privately. You downplay their achievements internally. You search for evidence that their success is not as meaningful as it appears, not because you truly believe it, but because your ego is trying to regain balance. The identity you hold about yourself matters deeply. Perhaps you have always seen yourself as the driven one, the talented one, the strong one, and now their growth challenges that narrative. If they are thriving in ways you're not, where does that place you? The loyal heart does not want to compete, but the insecure ego fears displacement. So the war continues quietly. You celebrate them publicly. You question yourself privately. You offer congratulations while carrying comparison. And the emotional dissonance becomes exhausting. Loving someone while resenting them feels like holding fire and water in the same hands. One part of you wants closeness, the other wants distance to protect what feels fragile. You may even hope for a small flaw in their story, a setback, a reminder that they are still human. Not because you wish them harm, but because perfection intensifies your insecurity. This contradiction does not make you heartless. It makes you human. Complex, layered, capable of conflicting emotions at the same time. But until the conflict is acknowledged, it continues shaping the friendship in subtle ways. The war inside the loyal heart is not loud. It is quiet, it is polite, it smiles. But underneath that smile, something is fighting to feel secure again. Resentment rarely begins with one dramatic moment. It gathers quietly, like sediment at the bottom of a river. At first, the water is clear, the current is easy, you talk for hours, you share without calculation. You feel seen. But over time, small things go unnoticed, or rather, they are noticed and then swallowed. The time they interrupted you and did not realize. The moment your achievement was brushed aside, the pattern of conversation circling back to them. Nothing severe enough to confront. Nothing obvious enough to justify hurt, so you tell yourself it is insignificant. You tell yourself you are being sensitive. You tell yourself it is not worth disrupting the harmony. But harmony built on silence is fragile. Every unexpressed disappointment sinks. Every time you felt overshadowed but smiled anyway. Every time you needed support but they were too absorbed in their own world. It does not disappear. It settles. Over months, sometimes years, and slowly the emotional current changes. You begin to feel slightly unheard, slightly unseen, slightly secondary in a friendship that once felt equal. Resentment is often not about their success alone. It is about imbalance. Who listens more? Who gives more? Who adjusts more? If you have quietly adapted to their moods, their schedule, their narrative, something inside may begin to feel depleted, and depletion can turn into bitterness. because somewhere beneath the comparison there may also be grief. Grief that you do not feel as important in their life as they are in yours. Grief that your milestones did not receive the same energy. Grief that the friendship no longer feels mutual. But instead of naming grief, the mind names resentment. It feels safer to be irritated than to admit you feel overlooked. It feels easier to withdraw than to risk saying, I need more from this. So the grievances remain unspoken, and silence becomes heavy. You may start replaying past interactions, reinterpreting old conversations through a new emotional lens. What once felt neutral now feels dismissive. What once felt casual now feels revealing. This is how resentment rewrites memory, not always inaccurately, but selectively. The mind begins collecting evidence to justify the discomfort, and with each unspoken story, the river grows murkier. The clarity fades. The ease becomes effort, the friendship still exists. The messages still arrive, the laughter still happens. But underneath it all, there is accumulation, sediment thickening the water. Until one day you are not reacting only to the present moment. You are reacting to months of quiet concessions, years of unvoiced needs. Resentment in many friendships is not sudden, it is layered. And beneath those layers is often something far softer than anger, a longing to feel valued again. There comes a moment when the weight of unspoken emotion can no longer stay quietly contained. It does not always explode, sometimes it simply cools. What once felt warm begins to feel neutral. What once felt close begins to feel formal. You respond but without depth. You meet but without presence. The resentment that once felt sharp now feels dull. And distance slowly replaces tension. This is the breaking point that rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There is no clear ending, no final argument, just a gradual fading. You begin sharing less. Not because there is nothing to say, but because saying it feels heavy. You hesitate before telling them good news. You filter your struggles. You protect your inner world from being compared again. And beneath that withdrawal is exhaustion. Resentment is emotionally expensive. It requires constant internal monitoring, constant suppression, constant pretending. Eventually, the nervous system chooses efficiency. It chooses distance. Sometimes this distance feels like relief, space from comparison, space from insecurity, space from the mirror they unknowingly became. But relief is often followed by grief, because you remember what the friendship once was. The laughter that felt effortless, the comfort that felt safe, the version of you that did not feel threatened in their presence. And a quiet question emerges. Was it ever about them at all? At this stage, some friendships fracture openly. Others remain intact but emotionally thinner. You still care, but the closeness has cooled. The warmth has dimmed. And what remains is politeness. Sometimes resentment hardens here. It becomes narrative. You begin defining them in narrow ways. You see only their ambition, only their ego, only their flaws. The mind simplifies complexity to justify distance, but sometimes something softer appears. A moment of clarity, a realization that the resentment was never only about their success or their personality. It was about what their growth stirred inside you, the dreams you postponed, the insecurities you avoided, the parts of yourself you did not nurture. And in that realization, resentment shifts. It is no longer just anger, it becomes information, a signal pointing inward, because often what feels like resentment toward another is grief for an unlived version of yourself. And when that truth surfaces, distance begins to look different, not as rejection, but as a crossroads. One path leads to permanent detachment, the other leads to deeper self-understanding, and the breaking point becomes not an ending, but a mirror. Well, there is a quiet shift that happens when resentment is no longer seen as proof of someone else's wrongdoing, but as a reflection of something unfinished within you. For a long time, the mind points outward. It studies their tone, their choices, their personality. It builds a case, it gathers evidence, it tries to make the discomfort logical, but eventually a softer question emerges. Why does this affect me so deeply? Not why are they like this, but why does their life touch something so tender inside mine? Resentment often forms around unclaimed desires, around ambitions you once carried but set aside, around parts of yourself that remain dormant while someone else dared to expand. When a friend becomes what you secretly wish to become, the mirror can feel unforgiving. It reflects possibility. It reflects courage. It reflects movement. And if you have been standing still, that reflection can sting. The mind may interpret their growth as arrogance, their confidence as insensitivity, their joy as excess. But sometimes what feels excessive is simply what you have not allowed yourself to embody. If they speak boldly, does it remind you of how often you silence yourself? If they take risks, does it echo the chances you postponed? If they shine openly, does it reveal how carefully you have dimmed? Resentment can be a protest against your own suppression. Not always, not entirely, but often enough to pause. It asks uncomfortable questions about identity, about direction, about authenticity. It exposes the gap between who you are and who you hope to become. And that gap is painful. It is easier to blame the mirror than to examine what it reflects. But when resentment is viewed as information rather than accusation, something softens. It becomes less about moral failure and more about unmet need, less about competition and more about longing. Perhaps you do not resent their success. Perhaps you resent the part of yourself that believed you could not pursue your own. Perhaps you do not resent their voice. Perhaps you resent how often yours went unheard even by you. The friend who triggers comparison may unknowingly illuminate your own buried hunger for growth, and hunger when ignored turns bitter, but when acknowledged, it can become direction. This does not mean every resentment is imagined. Some friendships truly hold imbalance. Some patterns require boundaries, but beneath many layers of envy lies a quieter truth. You are not angry at them. You are grieving a version of yourself. And once that grief is seen, resentment begins to loosen its grip. The mirror is still there, but it no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like an invitation. There is a tenderness that appears when you finally stop fighting what you feel. Resentment loses some of its sharpness the moment it is acknowledged without punishment, not acted upon, not justified, simply seen. For so long, the instinct may have been to hide it, to deny it, to polish your reactions so no one could detect the fracture underneath. But silence has a cost. It distances you not only from them, but from yourself. When you allow yourself to admit that their success stirred insecurity, that their voice exposed your quietness, that their growth highlighted your stagnation, something shifts. The emotion becomes clearer, less tangled. It is no longer a vague irritation. It becomes specific, human, understandable. Perhaps you needed reassurance. Perhaps you needed recognition. Perhaps you needed to pursue something you kept postponing. Resentment often dissolves when its hidden message is heard. This does not mean every friendship survives unchanged. Some relationships naturally transform. Some require honest conversation. Some gently drift apart. But clarity softens what confusion once intensified. When you stop pretending that love must be pure and uncomplicated, you make space for emotional maturity. Love can coexist with envy. Loyalty can coexist with insecurity. Care can coexist with comparison. The goal is not perfection, it is awareness. Because when you understand your own inner movements, you are less likely to project them blindly onto someone else. And sometimes the most compassionate act is not confrontation, it is self-honesty. You may realize the resentment was guiding you toward growth, toward courage, toward a neglected desire asking to be taken seriously. The friend you once envied becomes less of a rival and more of a reminder that expansion is possible, a reminder that you too are unfinished. And unfinished does not mean inadequate, it means in progress. If parts of this reflection felt familiar, if something quiet inside you was touched, it may be because this experience is more common than anyone admits. Secret resentment in friendship is not a sign that you're broken. It is often a sign that you are human, sensitive to comparison, protective of your worth. longing to feel significant in your own life. You are not alone in that. If you would like to stay connected to a space where the hidden corners of the human heart are explored gently and without judgment, you are welcome here. And if you feel comfortable, you may share your thoughts in the comments, not as confession, not as exposure, but as reflection. Your words might help someone else realize they are not the only one carrying complicated emotions in silence. Take a slow breath. Let the guilt soften. Resentment is not your identity, it is information, and you deserve to understand yourself with compassion. Take care of yourself.